everyone, it's Karolina Zbytniewska from EURACTIV Poland, and welcome from the beautiful German Hambach Castle, symbolic place for the German democracy. Today, our guest is Professor Eva Illouz, a prominent French sociologist and cultural theorist. Good afternoon, Professor Illouz.
Good afternoon. Very nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you too. So I find your sociological perspective on populistic politics fascinating, and your expertise in the field of research on populism is very refreshing and brings a new dimension to the discourse. Could you tell us a bit more about your new book, The Emotional Life of Populism: How Fear, Disgust, Resentment, and Love Undermine Democracy?
The purpose of this book is not to explain populism, which has been done many times through economic theories, explaining populism by rising inequalities and globalization and deindustrialization, or through cultural explanation, viewing populism as a backlash against the 1970s movement of democratization, or through the polarization thesis, that is, that political parties get so polarized that the right-wing constituency transforms itself into a populist constituency. Also, the explanation is that it is the elites actually which erode democracy from the top. This is the thesis by Bartels, very interesting thesis by Bartels. I simply want to characterize the ways in which democratic leaders speak and the ways in which they transform public speech. It is an arena that becomes saturated with highly charged emotional stories. Now, politics is always charged with emotions, and I don't think we should oppose or pitch an emotional populist politics against a rational politics. Yet, I think there is a difference in the ways in which, for example, you mobilize consultants, marketers, advisors in order to craft stories whose purpose is going to be to really channel, express, and shape lasting sentiment such as fear or affect or disgust or love for your own group. And this is what the topic of this book is. It is about the deep stories that are full of affect, that explain the social world, these deep stories are constantly repeated and hammered, and they come to shape the understandings of political actors. They came to shape their understandings also by keeping alive a certain reservoir of emotion which also justify their political position. And I was interested in the Israeli case because despite its unique features, the unique features, for example, of the geography or history of Israel, I think Israel has come to display some of the paradigmatic features of populism around the world. So it doesn't mean this explanation for populism holds the same. It doesn't mean it is the same. It simply means there is a kind of common grammar of these populist styles of leadership, which I was interested in looking at.
Out of the emotions that you focus on, which one is the strongest, and can some of these trump others, like be more important, more effective on populations?
So you ask a very difficult question, which I tried not to answer, but now you're forcing me to answer. The four emotions I discuss, just to maybe remind the listener, is fear, which is both demographic fear and security fear. Demographic means the fear that I will disappear because a population will be more numerous than mine, and security is simply the military threat. And then there is disgust, which I view as the emotion which we have towards groups we think of as inferior and as threatening the moral purity of our group. Then there is resentment, which is about an injury. It is about claiming equality. It is about envy. Resentment introduces, if you want, a discourse of woundedness into the political sphere. And then there is love for your people, love for your nation. If you ask psychologists of emotions, they would tell you that fear is the most basic emotion and that it is the one that trumps all others because it concerns fight and flight. But I don't think we should think in terms of psychology. I don't want to make political argument on the basis of psychology because I think that populism is first and foremost, perhaps, a reaction to the fact that many societies have become multicultural societies. And I think populism is trying to renegotiate the relationship between majorities and minorities. It's not its only dimension, of course not, but it's one that is very prominent. This is the reason why I would say that probably disgust and love of the nation, these two probably articulate this core of populism. Disgust of, remember the ways in which Trump spoke about the hordes of rapists and criminals who were coming from Mexico. These kind of representations of Latinos is bound to create the feeling of what I call moral impurity of certain groups. Disgust, I think, often is the emotion that characterizes the racist, whereas fear is the emotion of the tyrant. But then this you do in the name of something that you hold very dear, which is the America of yore, which is no longer, but which can be born again with the right politics. That's the great America that Trump wanted to revive. That's the same, I think, with almost all populist leaders. Orban leading the pact, but this is true as well of Netanyahu and Modi and Meloni and Le Pen. They all speak in the name of an undiluted, pure identity, national or ethnic, or sometimes even religious identity. And that is why, in fact, populism in a strange way now bears a relationship with religion. I say in a strange way because I don't think that most of the populist leaders are religious by any stretch of the imagination. They're not. Trump symbolizes everything, all the sins that a true Christian should be careful to never commit. Netanyahu is not religious. Le Pen is not. Meloni is the only one who I think is slightly different from this pack. But in general, populists as individuals are not religious.
Polish populists are. I wanted to ask you what your book should teach Democrats. How do you think we should learn from that? What lesson does it bring?
I think there are many things we can learn maybe from the Israeli case. I suppose this was your question. What can we learn maybe from the Israeli case? For one, I think that there is a kind of what I call a structural weakness of the left in front of the right, because the left divides itself very easily, and not only divides itself very easily, but also is not as determined to use all the means necessary to conquer and to stay in power. I think the right wing, if you look at the Israeli right wing or the American right wing, the Republicans, they are definitely the first who broke the norms of democracy and of governance in order to increase their power. In fact, a great deal of what it means to share power in a parliament, in fact, turns out to be based not on rules or regulations, but on norms. That is, things that people tacitly agree on. And the right is the first to have broken those norms and to have become actually, and I think a great deal of what started populism is the fact that there were many small norms that were broken. So I think the first lesson is you have to react very strongly the first time a small norm is broken. Connected to what I just said, it also means that the left should be I think, equally determined to grab power and stay in power.
Why do you think it isn't? Because we were even discussing yesterday that left often doesn't have the motivation to lead, to win. As I told you, in Poland, our new left and old left, they are comfortable on their fourth, third places. Where's the will to win?
The example I want to give is the one I started with in my response, which is that the left is very fractious. And in being fractious, it necessarily loses power. Whereas, I mean, if I take the case of Israel, when the right is very often able to pull ranks together and unite for a common cause, see now the unholy alliance between the Likud and various religious and messianic parties, quite often, and when, in fact, just before this election, there was an attempt to mix together, to merge two left-wing parties. One was Labor, one was Meretz. And obviously, the merger would have increased the power of the constituency. The leader of the Labor Party, who is a woman, turned down. And despite the repeated attempts to make her accept this, she turned it down. That's what I call not understanding or not wanting enough power. The very nuanced gray that I want to retain. Well, you may be just a bit darker than my own type of gray. That kind of obsession with retaining your own nuance of left-wing agenda is very typical of the left. And in these elections, not only did it mean, in fact, that with the party who agreed to enter into the merger but did not enter, was actually erased from the map. It never made it to the parliament. And the first party, who is the one who refused the merger, is also actually going to be erased from the map because the voters do not forgive and will not forget such a dramatic and gross mistake. So effectively, they were tiny to start with. They were made tiny from being very big. They're now very small, and they're going to be completely erased from the map. So what this means, again, is that there is something about the ways in which the left handles its own internal differences that is highly unconducive to political power. It cares too much about doctrinal purity than it cares about unity. That, I think, is a fundamental weakness of the left right now.
Final question. Politics is infused with emotions, but populist far right manipulates the emotions and is effective at that. Do you think that Democrats should use the same playbook to be effective?
You know, Chantal Mouffe has suggested that the left should be populist, and she is a close ally and advisor to Luc Mélenchon. I have to say that I find Luc Mélenchon's politics particularly distasteful, and I am of two minds. If populism means to tell very powerful stories, to mobilize through energy, not only through reason, the political passions that exist in society, if it means to talk about injustice, not only as a series of taxation policies, but by rousing indignation at the injustice that 10% of the richest get to pay much lower taxes, in fact, than the people who are struggling much more. I think that is not only fine, but that is really the way to go. But here I would make then a very strong distinction, because Chantal Mouffe speaks about left-wing populism, and what I'm speaking about is emotionalism. What I'm talking about is insufflating passion into politics. I am not for populism, because populism, as far as I understand it, is also about creating a very strong distinction between the people and the elites. And it is almost sanctifying the people, vilifying the elites, I think there are now too many elites, in fact, to really be able to say with clarity who are these elites without creating a kind of enmity and chaos inside society, when I think the left should really stand for much greater unity. Populism thrives on enmity and hostility inside the body politic. And I think that the ways in which the social democracy will or should win over populists is by showing the ways in which populists create incredible fragmentation and hostility and confrontation inside society. The only way to have a good society is to create peace, social peace, which does not contradict pluralism and even contradiction. You can let contradictions and pluralism flourish, but in an atmosphere of social peace. And that, I think, a populist ideology, whether it is from the left or from the right, cannot obtain.